Move it. Now. This is a restricted access point for active duty personnel, not a public thoroughfare for sightseers. The voice, laced with the kind of smug, unearned authority that comes from a position of minor power, cut through the low murmur of the grand atrium. The crowd of crisply uniformed junior officers and cadets parted like a school of fish around a lurking predator. They laughed, a nervous, uncertain sound, eager to be on the right side of the man with the silver eagles on his collar. Captain Marcus Hayes stood, hands on his hips, his jaw set in a mask of theatrical impatience. He was speaking to the woman in the wheelchair. She was a ghost in this world of polished brass and starched whites, dressed in simple gray slacks and a dark blue cashmere sweater that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Her hair, a cascade of silver and black, was pulled back in a simple, unadorned tie. Her hands rested calmly in her lap, fingers interlaced, still. She hadn't flinched. She hadn't spoken. She hadn't even looked at him, her gaze fixed instead on the vast, floor-to-ceiling digital map of global naval deployments that dominated the far wall of the Naval War College's VDM Stansfield Turner Strategic Operations Center. Her silence was a vacuum, and Captain Hayes, a man who abhorred a vacuum, rushed to fill it with more of his own importance. Did you hear me? This isn't a museum. The symposium is for flag officers and their designees. I don't see a uniform, I don't see a clearance badge, and frankly, you are creating a significant traffic obstruction at a critical ingress point. He gestured vaguely with a dismissive flick of his wrist. The public entrance is around the back, by the service docks. I'm sure they can accommodate. You, the insult, wrapped in the thinnest veil of procedural language, was as sharp and ugly as a shard of broken glass. He was not just dismissing her. He was erasing her, categorizing her as a piece of inconvenient human luggage. The younger officers shifted on their feet, their initial amusement souring into a collective, unspoken discomfort. They were trained to respect the chain of command, but they were also trained to recognize honor, and there was none here. But when Fleet Admiral Wallace, observing from the mezzanine above, saw her posture, he froze. It wasn't the wheelchair that caught his eye, nor her civilian attire. It was the way she sat, not slumped, not resting, but braced. It was a posture of command, a subtle alignment of the spine and shoulders that spoke of countless hours on a warship's bridge, riding the pitch and yaw of a vessel cutting through heavy seas. It was a posture he hadn't seen in nearly a decade. A chill, born of sudden, shocking recognition, traced its way down his spine. He knew that silence. He knew that stillness. The world knew the legend, but he knew the person. Down below, the woman finally moved. Her head turned, slowly, deliberately, and her eyes met Captain Hayes's. They were the color of a winter storm over the North Atlantic, and for the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed the captain's face. He saw not weakness, not confusion, but a profound and unnerving calm, an intelligence as deep and cold as the abyssal plain. If you believe that true strength is forged in silence and proven by action, not volume, type competence in the comments below. For a moment, the entire vast space seemed to hold its breath. The quiet hum of the building's climate control systems, the distant, muffled ring of a telephone, the soft scuff of 100 pairs of polished shoes on marble. It all faded into a backdrop for this silent, unequal confrontation. Captain Hayes had staked his authority on a public display of dominance, and the woman's utter lack of reaction was a more potent challenge than any shouted retort could ever be. He had expected fear, or at least indignant protest. He was prepared for tears or a stammered apology. What he received was nothing. It was like shouting at a mountain. Her stillness was not passive. It was an active, unnerving presence. It was the calm at the eye of a hurricane, a place of immense power that draws its strength from the chaos raging around it. The junior officers and cadets, who had initially seen only an arrogant captain and a civilian obstacle, now saw something else. They saw a profound disconnect between the captain's blustering and the woman's composure. They began to study her, truly see her for the first time. They saw the fine, faded scar that traced a delicate line from her left temple into her hairline. They saw the subtle, almost imperceptible tension in her jaw, the only hint of an iron while holding some immense burden at bay. They saw her hands, which they had first registered as simply resting, and now saw were positioned with an efficiency of purpose, ready, though for what, they could not imagine. Her wheelchair was no longer just a medical device. It became a throne of inscrutable authority. Hayes, feeling the silent judgment of his audience shift away from her and toward him, doubled down. Arrogance, when challenged by the immovable, often mistakes escalation for strength. "I will not ask you again," he said, his voice dropping to a low growl meant to convey ultimate finality. He took a step forward, his large frame casting a shadow over her. "You're interfering with military operations. You will move, or I will have you moved." He reached down, his hand hovering over the handle of her chair, the threat of physical force now explicit. It was a gross violation of decorum, a shocking breach of conduct that sent a wave of quiet gasps through the younger members of the crowd. To lay hands on a civilian, a woman in a wheelchair, in the hallowed halls of the War College, was unthinkable. It was the act of a bully, not an officer. But still, she did not speak. She simply held his gaze, her stormy eyes unblinking. It was in that moment that the world tilted on its axis. A klaxon, sharp and piercing, shattered the tension. It was a sound no one in that room ever wanted to hear outside of drill. The priority alert tone from Fleet Cyber Command. Every screen in the atrium, including the massive global map, flashed crimson. Data streams began to pour across the displays, lines of incomprehensible code and rapidly shifting threat assessments. The word Cascade appeared in bold, block letters at the top of each screen, a designation for a system-wide, multi-vector cyber attack of the highest severity. The murmur in the room erupted into a controlled chaos of urgent voices. Officers began speaking into their wrists, their phones, their comms, their training kicking in. The symposium was over before it had begun. This was real. This was live. Captain Hayes, his petty tyranny instantly forgotten, spun around, his face pale. His authority, so absolute a moment ago, had evaporated, revealed as the hollow shell it was in the face of a genuine crisis. He was a logistician, an administrator. He was utterly, hopelessly out of his depth. The command staff for the college began to file into the adjacent glass-walled command center, their faces grim. Through the transparent walls, the assembled crowd could see the unfolding panic. The officers were shouting, pointing at screens, their movements frantic and uncoordinated. The red cascade warning was now blinking, accompanied by a string of rapidly scrolling notifications. Aegis links severed, say, 74, Packfleet C4I offline. SAT uplink compromised, Atlanti. It was a digital decapitation strike. The Navy's nervous system was being systematically dismantled, and no one knew how or why. The woman in the wheelchair, forgotten in the initial seconds of the alarm, did not look at the panicked men and women. She looked at the data. Her eyes, which had been so calm and distant, were now alight with a fire of intense concentration. Her head tilted slightly, and her focus narrowed, scanning the torrent of information with an inhuman speed. She was not reading the warnings. She was reading the language of the attack itself, the syntax of the code, the rhythm of the data packets. She saw what no one else did, a pattern hidden within the noise, a faint, almost undetectable signal ghosting beneath the primary assault vector. It was elegant, it was brilliant, and it was a feint. The chaos in the Strategic Operations Center intensified, a symphony of escalating failure. Voices rose in pitch and tempo, overlapping into a meaningless wall of sound. "We've lost the entire Pacific Carrier Group network. I can't get a handshake from the Reagan or the Lincoln," a young lieutenant shouted, his voice cracking with strain. "The attack isn't brute force, it's surgical. They're not breaking the firewalls. They're walking right through them with what looks like valid authentication keys. How is that possible?" Another officer demanded, his hands flying across a keyboard to no effect. The senior officer in the room, a commodore with a face like carved granite, slammed his hand on the central console. "Give me Cybercom on the line now. Where's this coming from? Russia? China?" His questions were met with a chorus of "We don't know, sir," and "We can't isolate the source." On the main screen, friendly naval icons began to flicker and disappear, replaced by angry red squares indicating a complete loss of command and control. It was a fleet vanishing into a digital fog of war, rendered blind, deaf, and dumb in a matter of minutes. The system was designed to be redundant, to be resilient, to be unbreakable. But it was breaking, and breaking everywhere at once. The core assumption of their defense architecture was that an attack would come from the outside, but this felt different. This felt like it was coming from within. In the atrium, the crowd of onlookers, including a stunned and useless Captain Hayes, could only watch the disaster unfold through the soundproof glass. They were witnessing the digital equivalent of Pearl Harbor, a crippling blow delivered with shocking speed and precision. The very foundation of American naval power, its technological supremacy, was crumbling before their eyes. Amidst this maelstrom of technology and terror, the woman in the wheelchair remained an island of impossible tranquility. She had seen enough. Her methodical scan of the data was complete. While the men and women paid to solve this problem were chasing ghosts and reacting to the attacker's every move, she had gone still, her mind processing the intricate dance of code and countercode. She saw the logic trap, the beautiful, intricate piece of misdirection that had sent the Navy's best minds down a rabbit hole. The cascading failure wasn't the attack. It was a symptom, a smokescreen designed to draw all attention while the real work was done elsewhere. The true target wasn't the active fleet. It was something far more valuable. She turned her chair with a soft whir of its electric motor, positioning herself to face the glass wall of the command center. She raised a hand, not in a wave, but with a single finger extended, a quiet, deliberate gesture to get someone's attention. No one noticed. They were too consumed by the fire. She did it again, a little more insistent this time. A young ensign, tasked with fetching coffee and feeling utterly useless, happened to glance over. He saw her, the strange civilian woman from the confrontation with Captain Hayes. He saw her calm, her focus, and her gesture. Something in her expression, a look of absolute, undeniable certainty, compelled him. He hesitated for a second, then tapped the Commodore on the shoulder. "Sir," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "That woman, outside, she's trying to get your attention." The Commodore, his face a mask of fury and frustration, barely glanced at him. "I don't have time for civilians, ensign. Get back to your station." "But sir," the ensign persisted, his career flashing before his eyes. "You need to see her. The way she's looking at the board. She sees something." Annoyed, but intrigued by the ensign's sheer audacity, the Commodore finally turned and looked through the glass. He saw the woman in the wheelchair, her fingers still pointed, her gaze locked directly on him. Her expression was not one of panic or curiosity. It was the look of a surgeon about to make a critical incision. On a hunch born of desperation, he hit the button for the external intercom. "What is it?" he barked, his voice tinny and sharp through the speaker in the atrium. The room fell silent. Every eye turned to the woman. For the first time, she spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it carried with a resonant clarity that cut through the residual panic. It was a voice accustomed to being heard, a voice that did not need to be raised to command. "Commodore," she began, her tone level and precise, "your response teams are chasing a ghost signal. The cascading failure is a logic bomb, triggered by your own diagnostic countermeasures." A stunned silence fell over the command center. She continued, her words painting a picture of their predicament with chilling accuracy. "The attacker isn't trying to disable your fleet. They're using the fleet's automated defense protocols as a decryption key. Every time your system tries to reboot a compromised node, it offers up a piece of the primary encryption for the entire naval database. They are not shutting you down. They're making you give them the keys to the kingdom." The room was frozen. What she was describing was not in any textbook, not in any training simulation. It was an attack vector of such diabolical ingenuity that no one had ever conceived of it. "Stop all reboot sequences. Now," she commanded, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Sever the landline connection to the Pentagon archives. Do not use a software command. Have an engineer physically pull the cable. The breach is not in your network. It's in the legacy hardware of the archive server. The attacker is already inside." Her instructions were direct, counterintuitive, and utterly brilliant. They went against every standard operating procedure. The Commodore stared at her, his mind racing. Who was this woman? How could she possibly know this? But he could see the truth of it in the patterns on his screen, a truth that had been invisible to him moments before. The attacker wasn't breaking down the door. She was describing how they were being politely invited in and having the door held open for them. He had a choice: follow protocol and lose everything, or trust the impossible, inexplicable voice of a stranger in a wheelchair. He didn't hesitate. "Do it," he roared his team. "Do what she said. Kill the reboots. Get an engineer to the archive room now and pull every wire from the wall. Move." The team, galvanized by the sudden clarity of the commands, leaped into action. They stopped fighting the phantom attacker and started treating the disease. On the main screen, a miracle began to happen. As the reboot sequences were halted, the cascading failures stopped. The red squares ceased to multiply. The system, though still compromised, stabilized. It had stopped the bleeding. Then, a message appeared on the screen, no longer a system alert, but plain, simple text. "Nice catch. Until next time." And then, as quickly as it had begun, the attack was over. The ghost in the machine was gone. The entire Strategic Operations Center was utterly silent. The only sound the low hum of the servers and the heavy breathing of the men and women who had just stared into the abyss. Every single person, from the Commodore down to the young ensign, was turned, staring through the glass at the woman in the wheelchair. She, in turn, simply lowered her hand and watched the screens return to their normal, placid blue. Her work was done. Captain Hayes stood, rooted to the spot, his face the color of ash. The world had ceased to make sense. The woman he had insulted, threatened, and was about to physically remove as a piece of human garbage had just, with a few quiet sentences, saved the United States Navy from a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. The sheer, cosmic scale of his error was beginning to dawn on him, a crushing weight of shame and disbelief. Who was she? What was she? The answer was already walking toward her. Fleet Admiral Wallace descended the grand staircase from the mezzanine, his steps slow, measured, and deliberate. He did not look at the command center. He did not look at the assembled crowd. His eyes were fixed on one person only. The officers and cadets, sensing the gravity of the moment, instinctively cleared a path for him. They snapped to attention as he passed, a wave of disciplined respect rippling through the atrium. The Admiral was a living legend, a man who had commanded carrier strike groups in 2 wars, a sailor with a reputation for integrity and wisdom. His presence commanded a reverence that lesser men, like Captain Hayes, could only dream of. He walked without haste, his uniform immaculate, his chest a constellation of ribbons that told the story of a lifetime of service. He finally came to a stop directly in front of the woman in the wheelchair. He did not speak. He simply stood before her, his posture ramrod straight. Then, in a gesture that sent a shockwave of utter astonishment through every person watching, he raised his hand to his brow and delivered the sharpest, most profound salute of his long and storied career. It was not the perfunctory salute one gives to a fellow officer. It was a salute of deep, almost reverent respect, the kind a warrior gives to a monarch or a student gives to a master. He held it, his arm locked, his gaze steady. The silence in the room was now absolute, a heavy, sacred thing. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low baritone accustomed to commanding fleets, now filled with a quiet, personal warmth. "Evelyn," he said, the name itself a revelation. He then straightened and addressed her with her full, breathtaking title. "Admiral Thorne, my deepest apologies for the reception. I was not aware you were arriving in person today. I thought you would be patching in remotely." The name fell into the room like a 10-ton anchor. Admiral Evelyn Thorne. The name was a myth, a ghost story told to new recruits at Cyber Command. The architect of Operation Silent Trident, the classified offensive that had dismantled a foreign power's entire digital warfare capability without firing a single shot. The author of the Thorne Doctrine on network-centric warfare, now the bedrock of Allied naval strategy. A prodigy who had made captain at 32 and rear admiral by 40. A legend who had vanished from public life nearly 7 years ago after her command ship, the USS Thomas Gates, was struck by an experimental shore-to-ship hypersonic missile during a technology trial in the Pacific. The official story was that she had been medically retired, her career cut short by the catastrophic injury she sustained. The truth, known only to a handful of people at the highest levels of the Pentagon, was far more complex. Her body had been broken, but her mind, her once-in-a-generation strategic intellect, had emerged from the fire sharper and more formidable than ever. Admiral Wallace lowered his salute and turned to face the stunned, silent room. His eyes, hard as chips of flint, swept over the assembled officers, lingering for a blistering, soul-searing moment on Captain Marcus Hayes. Hayes looked like he had been physically struck, his face a ruin of dawning horror. Wallace's voice now became a thunderous roar, the famous bridge voice that could cut through the shriek of a gale and the scream of jet engines. It filled every corner of the vast atrium, each word a hammer blow of judgment. "For those of you who do not know," he boomed, "you are in the presence of Admiral Evelyn Thorne. Let me be clear about what that means." He began to pace slowly, his gaze pinning each and every officer to their spot. "This is the officer who, as a lieutenant commander, single-handedly rewrote the book on submarine electronic warfare. This is the captain who commanded the 5th Fleet Cyber Division and turned it from a backwater command into the most lethal digital weapon on the face of the earth. This is the admiral whose mind is considered a strategic national asset by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, classified at a level higher than the schematics for our nuclear submarines." He stopped and pointed a finger toward the now stable screens. "What you just witnessed, that little crisis, was a final entrance exam. A live-fire test designed by Admiral Thorne herself to be presented to our symposium today. It was a simulation of a theoretical attack vector she designed, an unwinnable scenario intended to expose the critical flaw in our legacy hardware integration. A flaw she identified 6 months ago, and that the bureaucracy was too slow to address." He let that sink in. The attack wasn't real. It was a lesson, a brutal, terrifying, and necessary lesson. Wallace's eyes found Captain Hayes again, and all the warmth was gone, replaced by an Arctic cold. "Admiral Thorne's presence here today was at my personal, urgent request to oversee the implementation of the countermeasures she herself designed. Her involvement in Project Chimera is one of the most closely guarded secrets in the Department of Defense. Your security clearance, Captain," he said, his voice dripping with contempt, "is laughably insufficient to have been briefed on this matter. You were not cleared to know her name, her purpose, or her history. Your only duty was to facilitate access for an authorized guest of the Naval War College. Instead, you saw a woman in a wheelchair. You saw a civilian. You saw an inconvenience." He took a step closer to Hayes, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper that was somehow more terrifying than his roar. "You did not see the uniform she can no longer wear because it was shredded from her body by shrapnel while she was pulling 3 of her crew from a burning command deck. You did not see the rank she earned not in boardrooms, but in the silent, unseen wars that keep you safe at night. You saw a problem to be moved, and in your breathtaking arrogance, you put your hands on a national hero and publicly humiliated an officer whose boots you are not worthy to polish. You are a disgrace to your rank and to this institution." The condemnation was absolute, a public vivisection of a man's career and character. Hayes didn't even have the strength to stand at attention. He was crumbling from the inside out, the structure of his ego reduced to dust. Admiral Thorne watched the exchange, her expression unreadable. There was no triumph in her eyes, no satisfaction. There was only a quiet, weary resolve. This part of the day was an unfortunate but predictable variable. Human ego was the one system she could never fully patch. The story of what happened in the atrium of the Naval War College did not just spread, it detonated. It moved through the institution first, whispered in hallways and conference rooms, then leaped to the fleet via secure emails and encrypted chats. Within 48 hours, every ship commander in the Atlantic and Pacific fleets had heard some version of it. The tale of Thorn and the Tin Captain became an instant legend, a piece of institutional folklore that served as a potent, cautionary tale. It was a story about assumptions, about the dangerous gap between appearance and reality. It became a lesson taught to new ensigns about the nature of true authority, which flows not from the rank on one's collar, but from the competence in one's mind and the character in one's soul. The details, as they always do, became mythologized in the retelling. In some versions, Captain Hayes had actually tried to tip her out of her chair. In others, Admiral Thorn had single-handedly rewritten the malicious code in her head and beamed it back at the attackers with a thought. The truth was dramatic enough, but the legend was more instructive. It cemented Admiral Thorn not just as a brilliant strategist, but as the living embodiment of the quiet professional, the operator whose work is silent and whose results speak for themselves. The official fallout for Captain Marcus Hayes was swift and severe. He was formally reprimanded by Admiral Wallace in a letter that was placed permanently in his service record, a death sentence for any future promotion. He was relieved of his prestigious post at the War College and reassigned to a dreary, forgotten desk job at a logistics depot in Norfolk, a place known as the Elephant's Graveyard, where careers went to die. But the official punishment was nothing compared to the personal one. He was a pariah. The same junior officers who had nervously laughed at his jokes now averted their eyes when he passed. His peers spoke to him only when necessary, their conversations clipped and formal. He was adrift, isolated by the stain of his own public failure. For 2 weeks, he wallowed in self-pity and anger. He drafted letters of protest, convinced he was the victim of a political game. But in the quiet, lonely hours of the night, Admiral Wallace's words echoed in his mind. You saw a woman in a wheelchair, he couldn't escape the truth of it. He had failed the most basic test of leadership, to see the person, not the vessel. The arrogance that had been his armor for so long had cracked, and through the cracks, a painful, searing light of self-awareness began to shine. He realized Wallace was right. He had been so obsessed with the symbols of power, the uniform, the rank, the procedures, that he had become blind to the substance of it. Finally, shattered and humbled, he knew what he had to do. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. He used what little pull he had left to find out where Admiral Thorn was working. He walked into the Advanced Cybernetics Wing, a building he wasn't clear to be in, and was immediately stopped by 2 stern Marine guards. He did not bluster or flash his rank. He simply said, "My name is Captain Marcus Hayes. I am here to see Admiral Thorn. I will wait as long as it takes." The message was passed up the chain. An hour later, an aide appeared and led him not to a grand office, but to a small, cluttered lab filled with servers and holographic displays. Admiral Thorn was there, working with a young lieutenant, her focus absolute as they analyzed a complex energy schematic. She did not look up when he entered. He stood there for a full 5 minutes in silence, waiting. When she finally finished her conversation with the lieutenant, she turned her chair to face him. "Captain," she said, her voice neutral, devoid of anger or pity. Hayes swallowed hard. He had rehearsed a speech, full of excuses and explanations. He threw it all away. He stood straight, his hands clasped behind his back, and looked her directly in the eye. "Admiral, ma'am," he began, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "There is no excuse for my conduct. I was arrogant. I was ignorant. And I was wrong. My actions were a stain on the uniform I wear and an insult to the sacrifice you have made. I failed to see the officer. I failed to see the hero. I only saw the chair. I am here to apologize and to tell you that I am ready to accept any and all consequences for my failure." He had expected a dismissal, a cold nod, perhaps a lecture. He did not expect what came next. Admiral Thorn looked at him, really looked at him, for a long moment. She saw past the disgraced captain and saw the man, stripped bare of his pride. She saw the flicker of genuine remorse in his eyes. "The consequences, Captain," she said, her voice softening almost imperceptibly, "are that you have learned a lesson. A painful one, I imagine. The most painful lessons are the ones that stick." She gestured toward the door. "Your new post is in logistics, I believe. The Navy's entire supply chain runs on a network that is 20 years out of date. It's vulnerable. It's inefficient. It's a problem that a man with your organizational skills could solve, if he had the humility to listen to the experts and the wisdom to see the real threats." It wasn't forgiveness. It was a challenge. It was a chance. She was offering him not an escape from his consequences, but a path to redeeming them through meaningful work. "See that the lesson sticks," she repeated. "Now, get back to your post. There is work to be done." Marcus Hayes felt a profound sense of release, followed by a surge of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He had come expecting to have his career buried, but she had handed him a shovel and pointed him toward a mountain that needed moving. He snapped to attention, his back straighter than it had been in years. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice clear and strong. "Thank you, Admiral." He turned and walked out, a changed man. He was no longer the preening gatekeeper of the atrium. He was an officer with a mission. The legend of Evelyn Thorne continued to grow, but she herself remained elusive. She deflected all praise, refused all interviews, and poured her energy into her work. She was often seen mentoring small groups of young officers, not in lecture halls, but in the labs and simulation rooms where the real work was done. Her teaching philosophy was simple. Competence was quiet. "Your results are your resume," she would tell them. "The noise of your own ego will only drown out the signal of the real threat. Listen more than you speak. Observe more than you act. And never, ever assume you know who is in the room with you." She became the Academy's hidden master, her influence spreading not through speeches and ceremonies, but through the quiet competence she instilled in the next generation of naval leaders. Her legacy was not in the battles she had won in the past, but in the one she was ensuring the Navy would win in the future. Months stretched into a year. The spot in the atrium where Captain Hayes had confronted Admiral Thorne became an unofficial landmark. Cadets would walk by and point, telling the story to newcomers. They called it Thorne's Perch, a reminder that the most unassuming position could be the one of greatest strength. The story became a mandatory part of the first-year ethics curriculum at the War College, presented as a case study in the dangers of bias and the definition of true professionalism. It was a living piece of history, a powerful anecdote that shaped the culture of the institution in a way no regulation or directive ever could. And in Norfolk, at the logistics depot, Captain Marcus Hayes was quietly making a name for himself. He arrived without fanfare, a disgraced officer sent to pasture. But he did not fade away. He worked. He listened. He learned the names of every civilian programmer, every enlisted supply clerk, every master chief who had been fighting the broken system for years. He brought them together, championed their ideas, and used his administrative acumen not to build his own kingdom, but to tear down the bureaucratic walls that stood in their way. He remembered Admiral Thorne's challenge. He worked 12, sometimes 16-hour days, mapping the vulnerabilities of the supply chain network. He fought for funding. He argued with contractors. He used the humility born of his epic failure as a tool, allowing him to connect with the people who did the real work. 2 years after his public humiliation, Captain Hayes stood before a Congressional Oversight Committee. He presented Project Lifeline, a complete overhaul of the Navy's global logistics network, a system so robust, so efficient, and so secure that it was hailed as a masterpiece of public sector innovation. He gave credit to his entire team, naming dozens of sailors and civilians, ensuring their contributions were recognized. He became a better officer not in spite of his mistake, but because of it. His greatest failure had become the crucible for his greatest success. On the day Project Lifeline was officially activated, a single, encrypted email arrived on his terminal. It contained no text, no signature, just a single image, a small, intricately designed coin. On one side was the insignia of Fleet Cyber Command. On the other, the image of a wheelchair wreathed in laurels. It was a command coin, a token of respect exchanged between warriors. He knew, without a doubt, who had sent it. He printed the image, framed it, and placed it on his desk, a permanent reminder of a lesson that had saved him. True strength is not the absence of scars, but the will to command despite them. True authority is not granted by a uniform, but earned through undeniable competence. And true legacy is not what you leave behind in your own name, but what you enable to continue forward in others. The story of Admiral Evelyn Thorne became more than just a tale of vindication. It became a core tenet of the modern Navy. It taught a generation that the most dangerous threats are not always the ones you can see coming, and the greatest assets are not always the ones who make the most noise. Her silence in the face of insult, her calm in the center of the storm, and her quiet dedication to the mission over ego became the new standard. Her legend was not a monument to a single person, but a foundation upon which a stronger, wiser, and more humble service could be built. For more stories where competence triumphs over arrogance, and where quiet professionalism defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories.